Thanks everyone for coming out tonight on Good Friday and the first day of Passover. And hopefully spring is on its way. It's a beautiful night tonight. And sorry about the venue mix-up. Hope that wasn't too much of an inconvenience, but we're really grateful that Emily and Friends Meeting House could accommodate us on short notice. So yeah, my name is John. I'm here with a group, Extinction Rebellion. So this is a talk that's given in two parts, and the first part is going to be a pretty hard look at the science of climate change, what scientists are telling us, and what predictions they're making about what our lives will be like in the near and in the foreseeable future. And then the second part is going to be, given that information, what is an appropriate response? What are things that we can do as individuals given those circumstances? One of the key tenets of our group is to tell the truth and to act as if that truth is real. This is a little bit unconventional approach to some of this material. A lot of it has been to date a little bit reserved, a little bit watered down, and I think part of that is there's a reluctance to scare people. There's an idea that if we confront the reality of what science is telling us, that we will we'll panic, or maybe we'll become paralyzed and not know what to do. We'll stick our head in the sand, or we'll just avoid the situation altogether. And we really feel that isn't really what happens, that when we actually need to confront reality, we need to look at the truth and act appropriately. You know, I've been worried about global warming and climate change for a long time, and it's been something that's been with me my whole adult life. I haven't been that much of an activist throughout that period. Off and on, got involved in certain things, but I became more involved in other aspects of my life, just raising a family and a job, and would pay attention to the news and would get worried occasionally when you'd see something. Seems like things were pretty bad, but at the same time, it also seemed like we were kind of making progress. There were some good signs of progress on global warming. Solar energy is getting cheaper, and we can buy LED light bulbs now, and people talking about being a vegan isn't as exotic as maybe it used to be, things like that. And I sort of felt like, well, things are going to sort themselves out eventually, and we'll kind of muddle through this, and it'll all work out. It's really this, the release of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report last year. So this is a group comprised of 90 scientists, peer-reviewed, something like over 4,000 papers. And they were charged with looking at some of the ramifications of the Paris Climate Accord and what the scenarios were for meeting that agreement at 2 degrees C of warming versus 1.5 degrees C of warming. And they were trying to look at sort of what are the differences of those scenarios. And this report really changed a lot of the dynamic in the movement and in our thinking, and for a lot of people took notice. Part of that is because the conclusion was pretty dire. And this is where, you may have heard of we have 12 years left, people saying that we have only 12 years left. This is part of their conclusion was that, yes, 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees is much, much worse than 1.5 degrees. And we have to do everything we can to limit ourselves to 1.5 degrees. And that's going to require drastic action. Cutting of CO2 emissions in half by 2030 and completely by 2050. And this would require just a mass mobilization on a global scale. So this came out last October, I think, and I remember seeing it in the headlines because I was following these issues, and I was I read through it and I was just sort of in panic mode for a while. I just couldn't couldn't believe what was happening. And I also couldn't believe that nobody around me was really talking about it. You know, like I came into work and sort of, oh my gosh, we have to do something immediately. What are we doing? And, you know, people would sort of have the same attitude that I had had previously, like, oh, you know, whatever, it'll be okay. Like it's, you know, yeah, whatever, you know, not really paying that much attention. And I think maybe people are sort of getting numb to this constant barrage of bad news and sort of are tuning it out. But a bunch of us really took note and took it very seriously. And the conclusion from this paper, from this report, was, you know, the tone had changed considerably from previous, you know, similar reports, previous IPCC reports and other. So, you know, read some of these. Deborah Roberts, the co-chair, said, "It's a line in the sand, and what it says to our species is that this is the moment we must act now. This is the largest clarion bell from the science community, and I hope it mobilizes people and dents the mood of complacency." And then Eric Solheim, the executive director of the UN, said, it's like a deafening, piercing smoke alarm going off in the kitchen. We have to put out the fire. So they're not, you know, sugarcoating it. Now, this is sort of the trajectory that came out of that paper that they were proposing. So it would require this drastic cut, half of CO2 emissions starting immediately, and taking us to 2030. And this is sort of a predicted scenario. If we were able to do that, this would be a predicted scenario, a predicted outcome. And you know, one of the things that you can see just from looking at this, or I can interpret a little bit, is that, you know, the warming that we're experiencing is very slow moving. It's already sort of in effect, right? So even like turning everything off right now, there's still a bunch of warming sort of built in that will continue for a while before it starts settling down again. And even here in this scenario, you know, there's a range of predictions, right? There's a possibility of going all the way up to 2, even with this drastic cut. Well, it turns out that there's a lot of sorry, I'm going to just see what this. Okay, so this is another view of this, of sort of the same information. And it turns out that there's a lot of the modeling that the IPCC didn't consider. But this is showing the sort of possible trajectories. So the red area there is stay on course, continue doing what we're doing, business as usual, continue putting CO2 in the atmosphere as we have been. And this is where we can expect to get by the end of the century, which is actually, you know, potentially north of 4 degrees, 5 degrees, 4.5 degrees. Celsius, yeah, right, exactly. So that's, what is that, like 8 degrees Fahrenheit? Yeah, 8.5 degrees Fahrenheit. Yeah, sorry, I've like been used to reading all this stuff in Celsius. I realize we're in America, we can't figure out Celsius yet. But yeah, it's also, you know, it's important to know that this is average temperature too, right? Not just, it doesn't mean that like every day will be exactly that much hotter. This is the average global temperature over the year. So the red pathway is...
And it also means that the extremes are kind of...
Yeah, well, we can have time to talk after. But yeah, so the different pathways here are the red area is business as usual, the light blue is the Paris Accord, and the dark blue is the recommendation. However, a lot of this modeling is assuming kind of a linear increase. And there's some scenarios that IPCC didn't really account for because they're very difficult to account for, they're very unpredictable. I just want to put this sort of in local terms too. So this is the scenario, the predicted scenario of this linear increase in our city. If we stay the course, this is what we would expect to see. It's not clear for me looking at this where we are now if we would be underwater or not. But you can see this is pretty severe. So this would be 2100 at 4 degrees. And yes, also the temperature increase isn't uniform. So we're talking about average temperature, but there are much bigger increases happening in the Arctic region. So this is showing a heat map, so where red is showing a larger increase in a certain area. And you can see that as the Arctic warms dramatically, that can cause ice melt and cold water to actually make other parts of the world colder. But you know, the gist of it is the Arctic is warming much faster than the rest of the world. We also do see, you know, huge temperature extremes now, right? In the summer months, we see huge heat extremes and extreme cold. It's all predicted. So I want to talk about some of these other scenarios that aren't in the models that the IPCC report considered. So these are things that would make some of these trajectories potentially non-linear. So just, all that means is linear is just a straight line, right? So you can look at kind of the amount of CO2 that we're producing and what the temperature rise is for that amount, and you can sort of plot that over time, and you can fit a line to that, and you can see, okay, there's this particular slope to this line, it's going in this direction, and you can try to predict where that's going to go in the future. But just for background, I'm not a climate scientist. I work in information technology, though, and I do have an understanding of statistics and data analysis, and one of the things about this method is that you can use that technique to sort of extrapolate into the area where you don't know. You don't actually have any real data, measured data for these extreme temperatures. What happens at 2 degrees or 3 degrees? We don't know because we've never lived in a planet that hot. So you can try to make those predictions, but it's risky to do so because other factors can make those predictions completely invalid when other things start to happen. So one of those scenarios is from something called the albedo effect. So, the Earth is bombarded with a huge amount of energy from the sun, and a certain amount of that is reflected back out into space. Some of it's now trapped by greenhouse gases, but another potential problem is that the ice sheet in the Arctic is a white reflective surface, and that reflects a lot of the energy back out. You can experience this yourself on a really hot day. If you're wearing a white shirt, you're going to be a little bit cooler than if you're wearing a black shirt. Or if you're out on a parking lot in the summer, it's much, much hotter on the black surface of the parking lot. So as the Earth warms and the ice melts, it leaves behind dark water that absorbs more energy and becomes hotter, which melts more ice. And you can have this sort of feedback loop, vicious cycle happening, which can actually start to accelerate some of the effects of warming. So now instead of having this straight line, you start having a line starting to curve upward. So this is a graph that is showing the Arctic sea ice, the volume of sea ice in the minimum, so this would be in the summer months. And the blue area is what the IPCC model was predicting. There's a sort of a range of predictions, right? You can't be exactly sure what's going to happen, but you can say with some amount of confidence it'll be somewhere in that range. And this looks like there'll be ice in the Arctic in the summer all the way through the end of the century. Won't have total melts, maybe worst case scenario by 2100. But the red line is what's actually being observed. So when we actually go out and measure the amount of ice that's there every year, it actually looks like that. It looks to me like a different shape and like it's starting to sort of accelerate downward. Don't know exactly. These things are hard to predict. These tipping point feedback loop problems are hard to predict when they're going to happen, and they'll say, we don't even really know until we're in it sometimes. So another potential scenario is at around 3 degrees C. So this is 7 point something, north of 7 degrees Fahrenheit. We might expect that the rainforests would be completely dehydrated and start to have wildfire problems like we have now in California. You could have severe droughts in the rainforest. If something like that were to occur while the rainforest goes up in flames, it has another compounding effect. Right now, the rainforests are absorbing a huge amount of CO2. They're acting like a huge buffer, and they're, we call them a carbon sink. They're absorbing all this CO2 gas. This would actually flip that equation around. So they would go from being something that is absorbing CO2 to something that's producing it. Have a compounding effect. And there are a whole bunch of other scenarios. Climate is a really complicated system, lots of interconnected dependencies of these weather patterns and climate systems. This is just showing a bunch of different possibilities and the way that there's interrelated effects when we start to see the Gulf Stream changing patterns due to changes in water temperature, or the jet stream changing trajectories. It can have these huge effects that we don't really know. And then the visualization with the ball is kind of trying to tell the same story, right? Like as we get hotter and hotter, it becomes harder and harder for us to do anything about it. It becomes harder to sort of push that ball back up due to these compounding effects. And right now, the CO2 equation, we think is sort of in our control. Like we could stop our behavior and just stop putting it out into the atmosphere. We probably actually have to take it out of the atmosphere to get back on track. But some of these tipping point scenarios are really scary because, that's where it could be out of our hands. It would be have this runaway scenario where there's actually nothing we can do, and it's not even really about CO2 anymore. There's just this feedback loop happening. So I want to read just a small excerpt from this book. This is a book that just came out in January. It was based on an article a couple of years ago by David Wallace Wells. And what he's been doing is trying to take a lot of this scientific information. A lot of it's really hard to read. A lot of it's very technical. And he's tried to put kind of a human narrative to it and put it in terms that we can understand, and try to understand, well, what will life be like really? And this is just the opening paragraph of that book I want to read. It's worse, much worse than you think. The slowness of climate change is a fairy tale. Perhaps as pernicious as the one that says it isn't happening at all. And it comes to us bundled with several others in an anthology of comforting delusions. That global warming is an Arctic saga unfolding remotely. That it is strictly a matter of sea level and coastlines, not an enveloping crisis, sparing no place and leaving no life undeformed. That it is a crisis of the natural world, not the human one. That those two are distinct. That we live today somehow outside or beyond, or at the very least, defended against nature, not inescapably within, and literally overwhelmed by it. That wealth can be a shield against the ravages of warming. That the burning of fossil fuels is the price of continued economic growth. That growth and the technology it produces will allow us to engineer our way out of environmental disaster. That there is any analog to the scale or scope of this threat in the long span of human history that might give us confidence in staring it down. None of this is true. So the book writes about some of the other effects. I showed a picture of sea level rise, and that also does go back to sort of a common narrative that we hear sometimes. We think, people talk about, the sea level will rise a few feet in 2100. And we can just kind of brush that off as something that's remote and distant and not really something to worry about. But the reality is that we're seeing extreme weather events all over the world right now. These effects are happening today. These are things that scientists predicted years ago, that as the Earth warmed, that more water vapor would go in the atmosphere, that would cause increasing intensity and severity of storms, bigger hurricanes, but then also imbalance, so we'll see increasing droughts and flooding and increases of wildfires. This is a slide from a single month last year of all the extreme weather events that happened in a single month, with over 4,000 people losing their lives and nearly 27 million people affected. This is a picture from somewhere fairly close to home. This is from the Camp Fire in California last year. It was one of the most devastating forest fires that we've experienced. In a 2°C world, I may get this slightly wrong, but we could expect to see something like 10 to 60 times as many wildfires in this country. And these are pictures from the Midwest, the flooding that just happened there. Again, caused by extreme precipitation, extreme cold that left the ground frozen and unable to drain the water, and then a massive storm that left devastation. But there's another angle of this too, which is that, in our country, we have a fair amount of emergency services and resources, and we can kind of recover from some of these events. It's getting to be increasingly more difficult for a number of people. There's quite a large number of people living in poverty in this country that have a hard time recovering from this. But the situation is really dramatic in other parts of the world and in the countries that don't have the emergency services and the means to recover from some of these disasters. And this is really a great injustice. We are responsible for producing all the CO2 emissions, and while you can't say with accuracy now that we're not affected ourselves, but the people that are more severely affected and least able to deal with it aren't responsible for any of the problem, creating the problem. And there's some examples from the news. This one from 2018 in Madagascar, more than 1 million people in Hungary, after weather conditions due to exacerbated by climate change, extreme drought and El Nino conditions, half the country's children have been stunted. This is a story that I didn't even hear about. I don't remember this in the news at all, and I feel like I try to pay attention to this stuff, and it's just not being reported or something. I don't know why. Maybe I missed it. I'm sure it was reported somewhere, but it's just not in the headlines you'd expect. This is just like devastating conditions. And this is kind of another view of that dynamic where there's a huge, like half of the CO2 is being produced by the richest 10% of the world. I'll leave that there. And this is from another major cyclone that it's just left devastation. This left, this was in, sorry, I'm going to get where it's wrong because I have another one in the deck. This was in Myanmar, or Mozambique. Yeah. Mozambique, yeah, this is the one that just happened in Mozambique, sorry. This was the largest cyclone to ever hit the southern hemisphere. Just hit us last year. It hit them last year. Left thousands of people dead and thousands of people missing. And now, secondary effects from trying to recover from that and dealing with sanitation and high incidence of disease. So to give kind of a human perspective of this, it's hard to imagine what living through an experience like that would be. And when we hear about it, we see these numbers. We hear about thousands of people missing. But to add sort of a human element or a human story, I want to have Elizabeth come up and read an account of a family of a woman, Mint Ai, who's from a small fishing village and was caught in an extreme weather event with her family. This was in 2008. This is the one in Myanmar.
Yeah. On May 2nd, 2008, Mind A, her husband, and their 2 daughters, aged 3 and 6, took their boat to a nearby island to buy wood. The family lived from selling the timber in Bogale and other towns. The family planned to sleep in their boat. They saw nothing unusual in the wind, which gathered steadily through the afternoon. But by 9 p.m., it had reached a force so frightening that they abandoned the small craft for the shore and scuttled into the first house they could find. Some 25 others were already cowering there. As the cyclone approached, it drove massive waves up the vast tidal rivers that drain from the Ayeyarwady Delta into the Indian Ocean. The floodwater surged over the island where Mind Ai's family were marooned, tearing the house from its stilt legs and driving its collapsing structure into a nearby haystack. I couldn't see anything. All I know is that people were grabbing the haystack and trying to hold on to each other as the water pulled at us. My husband and I held hands, and we each held one of the children. cast into the water, the couple grabbed the branches of a tree only to be swallowed up by the drifting haystack. Mind, I lost her husband's hand forever. Minutes later, she says the realization crept over her that life was also slipping from her 3-year-old daughter, who was still in her grasp. Stricken by grief, she gave herself up to the current, preferring to hold the tiny body of her daughter than try to save herself. Although I knew that my little daughter was dead, I told myself I would never let her go. The wind and the water had been too much for her, and she became as limp as a piece of cloth. Mind, I says she slipped in and out of consciousness until fortune saw her washed up on another island. Bits of wood were piling on top of me, and I was stuck beneath them. I struggled to get out, and realized I had let go of my child. I tried to grab her again, but could only find her leg. Then another wave hit us, and because her body was so slippery, I lost her.
So another point I want to make is that we're talking a lot about climate change, but there's a wider ecological crisis as well that is in some ways intertwined, in some ways exacerbated by global warming. But this is a pretty simple way to explain it or to understand what I mean, and it's this concept of Earth Overshoot Day. So this is a day in the calendar year at which we as a planet have consumed the amount of resources that the Earth can regenerate in a single year. The Earth has amazing regenerative power. It absorbs all that energy from the sun, and through photosynthesis, other mechanisms of transferring water around the planet, it can regenerate itself and regrow. But we're sort of going into debt every year. It's kind of like in a bank account when you're going into overdraft, where right now, or I think last year Overshoot Day was in August, so that was when we had used up 1 year's worth of resources, and then we kind of go into the capital reserve and use up some of our capital. So things like just resources like animal life and for food and water and topsoil. The last time we were within budget was back in the 1970s. I've explained this to people, and to me, sort of coming to terms with this, it's pretty clear. I mean, first of all, I think this is kind of what we mean when we say something's unsustainable, right? The difference between sustainable and unsustainable. And sometimes I have to remind people that unsustainable means it can't continue. That's the definition of the word. It has to stop. And we can try to get a handle on it and do that through our own actions and our own things that we can affect, or it will happen for us. It will come to a point where it just can't continue anymore. Things will break down. And what I wonder sometimes is, well, if that were happening, how would you know? What would the signs be that was starting to happen? Water scarcity is becoming a huge problem globally. There isn't a whole lot of fresh, clean water available, even though our planet is mostly water. But right now, something like 4 in 10 people in the world don't have access to clean water, or living without water sort of security. I guess is the right term. We have a huge aquifer in this country that we're fracking into right now. There aren't fresh water supplies. And similarly with topsoil, our fertile arid soil is being depleted at a pretty alarming rate. I think it's estimated that something like 70% of the topsoil has been lost to erosion and industrial farming. We're losing it at around 1% a year. One paper I read said that it's possible that we won't have any fertile soil left in about 60 years. This is already starting to show up in the data. This is another UN report about food scarcity and food security. after a pretty healthy, pretty reasonable decline of undernourishment and food scarcity, this is showing the two numbers here are, one is the raw numbers in just terms of numbers of people, and the other one is percentage. And the reason it deviates a little bit is just because there's more and more people, so the percentage changes. What we're seeing is that this trend is now starting to tick up the other way, and there's more and more people who are undernourished, and just basically not getting enough calories and nutrients, or starving. So some of the other effects that we're going to start to see, and we're already seeing, is a problem of migration, or need for migration, as parts of the planet become uninhabitable for more and more people. Yes, partly due to sea level rise of people living in the coast, but also due to these other extreme weather events and extreme temperatures. At a 2 degree C scenario, we would see many more numbers of days throughout the year where it's just not even safe to really be outside for very long. We're already seeing record temperatures being set every year. I think last year there was I forget where it was, like Australia maybe, there were temperatures up to 130 degrees. So this is predicted to become a cause of mass migrations. A lot of the tensions that we're seeing, conflict that we're seeing in different countries now due to immigration, due to climate refugees, people having to migrate because where they live is inhabitable anymore, is due to maybe a number of around 1 or 2 million people being displaced. This report is saying that by mid-century, that number could go up to 140, 200 million. One report said almost up to 1 billion people being displaced and having to move because where they currently live just isn't viable anymore. And as resources become scarce, essential resources like food and water, and other resources that we depend on, we can expect to see an increase in conflict. And another scenario that was in that IPCC report is that this could lead to, as this destabilization happens, it could lead to societies and countries becoming more and more dysfunctional. And I think we're seeing some of the signs of this already, I think. So the title of this talk is Heading for Extinction and What to Do About It. So I want to talk about extinction as a theme, why that's in the name of our group. The scientists are saying now that we are in a 6th mass extinction event, that species are going extinct at a rate of, in some cases, up to 10 times as fast as you would expect from this natural selection or natural causes. There were 5 other mass extinction events on the planet. One of them is, we're all familiar with, is the story of the dinosaurs getting wiped out by an asteroid. There are actually 4 others. And it's believed that those were caused by some kind of abrupt change to the climate. Something that happened quickly enough that life on the planet wasn't able to adapt. The evolution wasn't able to sort of adapt and accommodate the changes quickly enough. And there was huge species die-off. And one of the mass extinction events led to 97% of life lost on the planet. And then just in sheer numbers, the amount of populations, the average loss of populations of animals is 60% since the 70s. So it's like a staggering number of just lives lost in that period of time. Just to put it in human terms, if we were people and we lost 60% of our population, that would be the equivalent of all of North America, South America, Africa, Europe, China, and Oceania. And so then we have to ask ourselves, are we on that list too? What happens to human life? I was reading about David Wallace Wells and saying how we have this myth that we're separate from all of this, that somehow the humans are separate or that we're in control. But are we on the list as well? There's a paper that is studying some of the effects in the oceans now. You know, the increases in acidification due to absorbing all the CO2, the rises in temperature in the oceans, and the hypoxia or lack of oxygen. So there's now huge dead zones in the ocean. There's no oxygen. And what they're finding is that they're saying, their conclusion was that they're seeing sort of similar conditions to that mass extinction, end Permian extinction when 97% of life was lost. And the end of the paper says, you know, because similar environmental alterations are predicted outcomes of current climate change, we would be wise to take note. I mean, it's kind of an illustration of how toned down a lot of the scientific literature is, right? But this is, you know, this is what they're saying. It's like, hey, it looks like what we think happened back then in that previous mass extinction. We're seeing some of the very similar signs happening right now. So I want to try to use an analogy here about kind of where I see our current situation, our predicament. So we can imagine ourselves like we're all on a ship together. We're all on this spaceship, planet Earth. We're all on a ship. And we're on a particular course. And everything that we have is on the ship. We can't get anything else. It's and all of us are on the ship. Everyone's on it. And we can see this danger up ahead. You can see these warning signs up ahead. And like a ship, in order to avoid that danger, we have to start steering the ship immediately. We have to grab a hold of that wheel and start turning it, because then the ship is turning very slowly. It's moving and it turns slowly. It's hard to make fast movements. And then at the same time, there are currents in the ocean that could start to pick up and that could start carrying that ship, such that even turning that wheel fast enough isn't going to be enough. And we're going to go careening into some of these more dangerous scenarios. So, I think that, it's, nobody knows, like, if it's really possible at this point that we would go extinct. It's really hard to contemplate. It's really sort of hard to imagine. But, a paper did study this and claimed that there's already a 1 in 20 chance of that occurring, given the amount of CO2 that's already in the atmosphere. And they're talking about the effects of temperature rise and sort of predicting what will happen at certain degrees of global warming. That chart I showed a while back that was showing that red trajectory, if you notice, it didn't stop at 2100, right? It kept going and going. Like a lot of our narrative sort of stops at this year 2100. But these effects are in motion, and they continue, right? So maybe it continues for another 100 years. This, like what we're looking at now, I mean, in this quote here, if you try to imagine, what this means, a 1 in 20 chance this is possible, those aren't great odds to me. Like if I were about to get on an airplane and the pilot said, by the way, there's a 1 in 20 chance this plane's going to crash, I wouldn't get on the plane. I wouldn't take those odds. But that's exactly what we're doing with our children. It's like we're putting our kids, our grandkids on that plane. So I'm going to pause here for a moment, and I'd like to have a few minutes of silent meditation. Just pause and reflect on the first part of the talk. Okay, welcome back. So we'll move on to part 2, which is we talk about what we can do about the situation and what we think is, or how do we think, what do we think is an appropriate response to this, both emotionally and practically. What is the action that we can take? For me, when I first absorbed a lot of this information and heard earlier versions of this talk, I was experiencing a wide range of emotions, a lot of sadness, anger, some amount of denial. And you recognize it as really a grieving process. It's kind of like being told that a loved one is diagnosed with a terminal disease. It's a process. Grief is a well understood process. It's something that we are adapted to experience. We live with loss, and there isn't really any way to sort of turn it off and make it go away. You have to go through that process. But I think, for me anyway, is that I think that taking action and thinking about how I want to live my life and committing to doing something about this crisis, whatever I can, has been an antidote for that. So we're kind of at this juncture where we need to grab a hold of that wheel and turn it hard in one direction. But there are forces that are holding onto it as well. They're holding onto that wheel, and they're trying to keep it on its current course. Some of what's happening almost seems like they're trying to turn it the other way, almost intentionally. I don't know. I want to read through the demands of this group, some of our the demands of Extinction Rebellion, what we're asking for of everyone, for our movement. I'll read through these and maybe explain a little bit about it. So the first one is that the government tell the truth about the climate and wider ecological emergency, and reverse inconsistent policies and work along the media to communicate with citizens. We don't think that this is happening at all. We think that many in the government are outright denying the issue here. And we think that the story needs to be understood. There's too many people who don't even really know that global warming is a thing at all. Number 2 is that the government enact legally binding policy measures to reduce carbon emissions to net zero by 2025 and to reduce consumption levels. So this is, pretty bold statement. It's a pretty aggressive timeline. It's not clear that it's exceedingly hard to do. It would be exceedingly difficult to do, and it will require radical changes. But we think that this is what needs to be done. We think that this timeline is commensurate with the emergency that we're facing. Third demand is that we want a just transition that prioritizes the most vulnerable people and indigenous sovereignty and establishes remediation led by and for communities suffering environmental injustice. And then the fourth demand is the creation of a citizens' assembly to oversee the changes as part of creating a democracy fit for purpose. So I do want to talk about this one a little bit because it was an interesting concept to me. I had not heard of what a citizens' assembly is. Those are the 4 demands. So if you notice, we're not specifying a specific solution. We recognize that that's extremely difficult to do. But in order to oversee the implementation of policies required, we were asking for a citizens' assembly, which is essentially like a jury system in a way. The idea is that you nominate or randomly select a group of citizens, and that they would deliberate over certain policy implementations. And this is actually not something that we made up. There's a foundation that has studied this method of policy making, the Sortition Foundation. And it's actually been applied in governments successfully. In Ireland, for example, is used for abortion policy decisions. Sometimes for things that are sort of difficult politically for elected government to do. It essentially strengthens democracy. It creates a much more representative government. This is where I need my notes. Oh, and I also wanted to point out, when I was researching this a bit, I found that it was used here in Massachusetts. This technique was used for one of the ballot questions, where a group of citizens were selected to sort of write how the ballot question should be communicated. That was in the 2016 election. When you ask people, you look at sort of the way that governments or the way that civil societies are organized, there's pretty broad agreement that democracy is the way to do it. That's the right way. There's a pretty broad agreement of that it seems to be the most successful way that we've found to organize ourselves. And some of the attributes that we like in a democracy, I'll just read some of them: equality, fairness, justice, legitimacy, accountability, and security. On the flip side of that, most people now don't believe that we are living in a representative democracy anymore. It's been characterized as a flawed democracy. That's because it's been distorted by other forces. The media, lobbyists, vested interests, different factions, and desire for power. So these are people now that are sort of in charge of handling the situation in a major way. David Bernhardt is the new appointed Secretary of the Interior. He has a background in oil and gas lobbying and is effectively dividing up federal land to mining operations and drilling for oil. And Andrew Wheeler in the EPA comes from the coal industry and is a coal lobbyist. He's doing things like, the EPA has been doing things like changing the allowed amount of pollution in the atmosphere to a higher level and then claiming that the air is now less polluted because of that. But also, in the previous administration, didn't have a great record on this either. Obama bragged about increasing the oil and gas production of this country, and that we had gone from this oil importer to an exporter. Huge increases in oil and gas and in dangerous mechanisms like tar sands oil and fracking. And the industries are extremely powerful and put a huge amount of money into lobbying efforts. They spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year lobbying the government for certain policies or to fight certain policies. So for example, there was a proposal to put a carbon tax that would try to start to add some of the price of burning CO2 into the economy, into the economic equation, try to look at use market forces to deal with this. And these industries fought that. They spent $30 million fighting it, and it failed. And they, at the same time, received something like $20 billion in subsidies. So they're rewarded for this effort hugely. And they don't have to do anything to address any of the problems that they've caused. They have no responsibility for any of the ecological harm or damage. So this kind of raises an ethical question, right? I mean, what do we do if our government isn't acting in our best interests? What is our responsibility to deal with that? And what is our sort of duty as members of a democracy to protect our democracy? And some of the answers to this cut across the political ideologies too, political spectrum. I just want to read a couple of quotes. John Locke, from the liberal philosophy, So the body of people may, with respect, resist intolerable tyranny. And Thomas Hobbes, a conservative political philosopher, said people have the right to resist the state if it threatens their lives. This is seen as sort of a moral obligation or a duty as members of a democracy. So I want to talk about specific tools and tactics and techniques for going after this as citizens. There's a form of activism and community organizing that's been practiced for decades, if not hundreds of years. It's been studied and well understood and documented, some of the techniques and tactics that we can apply. Things like gathering in a local community and creating a petition, supporting political candidates and getting them elected, or putting pressure on legislators and representatives for certain issues. And these methods are really great, and it's what we've been doing for a while to address this, and they've gotten a lot accomplished. And we may think that this would be successful, that eventually things will move in the right direction. But at this point, I think it was going to take too long. These methods just take a long time. If you go back to the beginning of the talk, we're talking about very, very short time frames. In the span of a decade, we have to turn things around dramatically. So this isn't the first time that populations of people have faced a severe threat like this. We're calling this an existential threat. There are populations of people who have experiences in this country that, frankly, when I read this article, it's a blog post, kind of talking about climate change, but in the context of other struggles in other populations. And it was really eye-opening for me because it's an experience I don't have and I can't have. But there's a population of people of color, African Americans in this country, who were brutally persecuted for centuries, hanged and tortured and beaten and murdered. A lot of what we think about from the civil rights movement was about segregation and trying to end segregation and voting rights. But the reality is people were really fighting for their lives. And we're contemplating the choice of having children or not, bringing them into that world. Which is something that people are talking about now in the climate crisis. And I want to look to some of that movement as inspiration and other movements that have caused very swift, very dramatic change in a short amount of time in societies. So there's another researcher, Gene Sharp, who was here at Harvard and then at UMass Dartmouth, passed away recently, last year. He did an extensive study of sort of nonviolent tactics, nonviolent struggle, nonviolent action, and try to catalog what are the methods that are effective, what are the ways that it can work and actually create change. And his work is amazing. I've been reading through a lot of his work recently and learning about him. There's a really wonderful documentary that you can find for free on the internet called, a provocative title called How to Start a Revolution. And his writing and these tactics have been used successfully in major revolutions, even fairly recently. Some of the recent struggles in Egypt or in Serbia, or the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and the Baltics, fighting for independence from Russia. All of these groups actually studied Gene Sharp and studied his specific writing. And he went and did workshops with them, and they learned these tactics and techniques. he was helping them, coaching them through a situation where, it's very different. I recognize it's very different than the situation we're here in the United States. If we're in a democracy, some of these people were in a situation where they were dealing with a brutal dictatorship. And also, doing things that, if they didn't apply strategies correctly or tactics correctly, could be disastrous for the people involved, right? But some of the elements that were the key elements of making these movements successful, he distilled, were that nonviolent action has to be respectful, has to be disruptive, has to be sacrificial, and it has to backfire. I mean, backfire on the oppressor, on the oppressive force. Gene Sharp also studied the work of Gandhi and what made his movement successful. Gandhi recognized that the people in power, he was dealing with this imperial force, Imperial Britain, occupying his country. He had this insight that these people have power over us, but they don't actually have power in any intrinsic way. They're not sort of superhuman, powerful just on their own. The reason they have power is that we're going along with what they want us to do, what they tell us to do. We're cooperating. And if we withdraw that cooperation in a peaceful way, they won't have any power over us anymore. We just won't participate in that. And it does have to be respectful, right? I mean, we are out in confrontations with the police. Police, even in this country, well, I shouldn't say even in this country, police will provoke us. They will try to get a reaction. They are aggressive. But it's very important to be respectful in any of these encounters. It's something that I've sort of struggled with a little bit in my life. I have a hard time with authority. I think a lot of people don't like people telling them what to do. But the way I think about it, the way I come at this now is really from a sense of empathy and thinking that, this is a situation that affects everyone, right? So if somebody is, in a position of authority or carrying out an order, they're in this too, right? They're on the same ship with all of us too. And we're really trying to sort of wake everybody up and hopefully convince them to join us. So Erica Chenoweth has also studied nonviolent action, has compiled a huge data set from looking at a bunch of different actions and what was effective, and also looking at it from the angle of different kinds of tactics, so looking at violent tactics versus nonviolent tactics. And the key takeaway here is just that nonviolence is twice as likely to be successful than violence. And it has to be disruptive. We're causing some discomfort. We're engaging with the public directly. There are definitely tactics that we can do to go after a bad company or particular bad actors and things like that. And we will do those things, but that's also something that people can kind of ignore in a way, because they can look at that happening and feel like, well, that's between these activists and this other entity and has nothing to do with me, it doesn't involve me at all, and they can just kind of carry on and forget about it. But if they're inconvenienced in some way, they might get pissed off, they get angry about it, but they're also forced to confront it. It forces people to sort of confront this moral question. Are you in favor of continuing with business as usual and continuing to burn these fossil fuels and destroying all life on the planet? Are you against that? And you have to sort of ask that question. Now, this is from a demonstration in University of Washington. I think it was against the Cambodian War, which is sort of a prolonged extension of the Vietnam War. It was another campaign that was started towards the end of that. And the government withdrew from that campaign after 8 months from huge student strikes out on the street. And then the actions have to be sacrificial. We are putting ourselves out in somewhat hostile situation sometimes. It's a statement that we're making with our bodies, and when there's more crackdown from police, it can have a backfiring effect. You know, we think that we make a lot of decisions based on analytical reasoning and looking at data and sort of making informed decisions. But the reality is a lot of decisions that we make is based on emotion, based on how we feel, and based on empathy. And you know, seeing other people going through an experience, and it gives us an emotional reaction. This is a turning point in the civil rights movement when the police cracked down on protesters in a severe way. People saw these images and just couldn't believe that this was happening. It was a real turning point for that movement. And it doesn't require that we get every single person on board. We don't need to reach 100% of the population. Erica Chenoweth found from her studies and this research in this database that she compiled that we really only need 3.5% of the population to be actively engaged. So 3.5%. It's a little north of 3 out of 100 people. It's still a huge number in terms of raw numbers. We do need everybody we can get. I did the math, and 3.5% of the US population is roughly 3 times the size of the Women's March. So it's a very, very big number. But it seems feasible. It's also not strictly required. The 3.5% number is saying, well, if you could get those numbers, if you could get that many people in the street, there's a very high likelihood that you'd be successful in getting what you want. But there are other tactics too, like in the Freedom Riders, they had 400 people arrested, but they also used tactics like forcing those cases to go to trial, because that's another way of forcing that conversation to happen, forcing that moral confrontation. If you go in, if you get arrested and you get a ticket and you're let go, that act is significant. But if you go all the way to trial, it forces the system, the legal system, to confront that same moral issue. There was a case recently decided from some activists who were climate activists who were Quakers, I believe, or Friends, right? And they were charged with very serious crimes because they were physically blocking building of a pipeline, got in the trench where they were trying to dig the pipeline. And they were brought to trial. I think they were initially found guilty. They appealed. They took that to trial again, and they were acquitted. And they were acquitted on the defense of a necessity defense. This is really huge for the movement. That the acts that they took were necessary to protect their lives, right? Given the circumstances, they were necessary. And another idea we have is that this is sort of showing kind of a range of involvement and a range of concern about the issue, right? So if we think of it as sort of a normal distribution, you have so this is this bell curve over here. So the idea there is that you have some segment of people on way on the far side. So the line there would be people who care about climate change or something like that, right? People who care about this issue and think that something needs to be done. So people on one end of the extreme, maybe couldn't care less, or don't think it's happening at all, or think it's all made up, or just totally in denial. Where people over on the right are very active, frontline activists. This is their life. This is all that they do. They're very, very engaged and very involved, trying to do everything they can. And the theory is that if we can reach enough people and tell this message to enough people and activate enough people, that we can get some percentage of the people on the right-hand side who are concerned, but they're not as active as they could be, to start doing more and start getting involved and becoming more engaged and more active. So I just want to show some of the scenes from the week in London this week. This is our parent organization. I don't know, the main chapter, the mothership, right, in London. So they've been building this movement for a number of months, actually for a remarkably short time, given the size of it. Giving these talks everywhere they can, reaching as many people as they can, doing all kinds of smaller direct actions. Some of them, like this one here, is a more sort of symbolic street art, street theater kind of action where they did a funeral procession for our future. But then, and then also, some of it's very festive, it's very fun. A lot of it is within the group is trying to imagine this different world that we want to create. What would that be like if we lived in that world? And trying to organize ourselves as a group and as a culture within ourselves to live in that new world. So this is Waterloo Bridge. They took over the bridge and brought trees out there and were planting gardens and had a skateboard ramp. I have ambitious plans for Boston. I don't know. And they had large numbers of people arrested, hundreds of people arrested. And this is a picture of the Boston chapter of Extinction Rebellion this past Wednesday. So we had about 100 of us gathered at the old State House and held a rally there, and then took our message to the Boston Globe and gave them demands that were sort of consistent with our demands of telling the truth. And we were kind of asking them, it was sort of an invitation, to ask them to be an ally and to help us tell this story, but really to point out that they're not covering this issue with the urgency that's really required, right? I mean, the information that I went through about how serious the situation is seems like it should be on the news every day, right? I mean, this is sort of all hands on deck. What are we going to do? And it's it's not on the front page. The quotes from the scientists saying that there's a 1 in 20 chance that we're going to go extinct. Those are in paragraph 4 or something. It's just not prominently in these stories where it should be. So yeah, this is great. This is our sort of first coming out event in Boston. And this is a picture from New York City. I went down there and met a bunch of these folks while they were planning this event. What they did was, I just thought it was brilliant and amazing. So there's a proposal in Manhattan now, which is to build a seawall around Manhattan. They're going to deal with the sea level rise. They're going to build a wall to block out the entire ocean. And so at this event, XR brought their own wall. So that's what this is in the background, is the seawall over here. So they brought a wall complete with graffiti and XR symbols on it. And then staged this massive die-in of all the people left on the outside of the wall. And this was also, incidentally, blocking the access to the Brooklyn Bridge. So I think they actually had 60 people arrested in this event. And this is getting attention. It's getting noticed. It's showing up in headlines. It's creating a conversation that we need to have. XR is getting on the news. They're being interviewed. People are starting to talk about this issue a lot more. And I will say, it's not just XR, right? There does seem to be a groundswell here of other amazing groups, like the Youth Strike and Sunrise Movement, Mothers Out Front. There's a lot of people talking about this, and even talking about it in politics with proposed solutions. And we're all over the world, trying to grow everywhere. There's XR chapters throughout the world, and they're all doing really amazing, creative things. So this is sort of our plan going forward. I'll say I didn't update it this week, but so one of our plans is to tell this talk wherever we can, to give versions of this talk. We need people willing to learn how to do it. It's a fairly difficult talk to do. It's long and there's a lot of information. But if you're interested in that, we can help. So we need to spread this message and make this information understood. This week is the middle of this big week of rebellion, so we were participating in that on Wednesday. And then we will continue because this is a sustained movement. This isn't going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen from one action. It's going to happen after repeated action, which is relentless. I basically have the attitude now that that there's no backing down. Like, what is there to lose at this point? Like, this is just all I'm going to do. Because the alternative is what? You just stop and go away and let this crisis unfold. I mean, I just can't do that. So I have another reading, but first I just want to talk about again, why I'm here and why I'm doing this. I have 3 children now. I have my youngest boy is 11, and he's just the joy of my life. He's full of wonder and curiosity. He loves reading. When he was younger, he would read all these encyclopedia picture books that just had pictures of all the life in the sea, all the sea animals, and all the different kinds of shellfish and sharks. And I'm terrified for the world that he's already living in now, and the trajectory that we're on is that all of these extreme conditions that we're seeing are just going to get worse and worse. And that's the path that we're on. Things are going to get worse before they get better. Regardless of what we do, we're on this locked-in trajectory for a while. And so, I have to be out here fighting for him, doing whatever I can. I mean, I owe that to him. I need to be able to tell him that I'm doing whatever I can do. And so I'm going to close now with a famous poem, and then we can break and you may have questions. There's a bunch of folks here from XR who can talk to. And then we also have information about our group and sign-up sheets in the back. So this is a poem by Mary Oliver. And it's called The Summer Day. Who made the worlds? Who made the swan and the black bear? Who made the grasshopper? This grasshopper, I mean. The one who has flung herself out of the grass. The one who's eating sugar out of my hand. Who's moving her jaws back and forth instead of up and down. Who's gazing around with her enormous and complicated eyes. Now she lifts her pale forearms and thoroughly washes her face. Now she snaps her wings open and floats away. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I don't know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel down in the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I've been doing all day. Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild, precious life?